Do you know what Saint Teresa of Jesus did with the altar in her cell every Holy Thursday? And why that particular act was for her the most important of the entire Holy Week? It wasn't simply lighting a candle. It wasn't arranging a few fresh flowers. It was an act of sanctification with a specific form, with precise objects, with an intention that Teresa herself recorded in her writings, and that very few people have ever read with eyes open wide enough to understand what she was truly doing. The home altar on Holy Thursday is not decoration. It is the place where the grace of that night can enter your home in a way that no other day of the year permits. And if you don't know how to sanctify it, something closes, quietly without you even noticing. Something that Teresa would never have left closed. That feeling you get when you kneel before your altar during Holy Week and the prayer just won't seem to catch fire. That's not a lack of faith. It's a lack of knowing. Teresa felt it too before she understood. There was a night when she herself knelt before her oratory and realized that the altar was not prepared to receive what Holy Thursday brings. And from that night forward, everything changed. What she learned is in her writings. What she practiced has an order, a doctrine, a beauty that few people know, and that is reaching you today. Before you continue listening, write just one word in the comments, the name of the person for whom you are going to sanctify your altar this Holy Thursday. That name deserves to be spoken tonight. And if you want every Holy Week to arrive in your life with this kind of depth, subscribe now, because what this channel offers was made for souls like yours. What you are about to hear is going to change forever the way you look at that corner of your home. And you need to hear all of it from the beginning, because each part of what comes next depends on what came before. There is a word the Saint Teresa of Jesus uses in the interior castle that most readers pass right over, because it sounds too simple to carry what it actually holds. The word is dwelling, not in the abstract theological sense that scholars have debated for centuries, but in the most concrete and domestic sense that Teresa had in mind when she wrote it. A place where someone lives. A place where someone truly dwells, with presence, with warmth, with the unmistakable mark of whoever calls it home. Teresa did not choose that word by accident. She chose it because she understood something that we have forgotten over the centuries, lulled by the comfort of modern life, that the human soul does not float suspended in the air, cut off from the physical space around it. The soul inhabits. And the place it inhabits gives it shape, temperature, possibility, or takes those things away. When Teresa describes the soul as an interior castle with many dwelling places, she is saying something that has direct consequences for your home and for the altar you keep there. She is saying that the spiritual life does not happen only on the inside, in that invisible space that no one can see or touch. It happens on the outside as well, in the environment the soul chooses for moving, praying, and encountering God. The interior castle Teresa describes has a threshold. It has a door. And that door, in the concrete life of a Catholic family, stands within the home. The home is the first circle of the castle. It is the space where the soul begins its journey toward the inner dwelling places, or where that journey is interrupted before it ever starts. This is not decorative metaphor. It is a doctrine with practical consequences that Teresa lived out firsthand during the years she spent founding convents across Spain. Every time Teresa arrived at a new place, the first thing she did was not organize prayer schedules or assign the sisters to their cells. The first thing she did was prepare the oratory, because Teresa understood that the oratory was the heart of the convent, just as the home altar is the heart of the family. If the heart is not properly prepared, everything else beats out of rhythm. The domestic altar has a history in the Church that reaches back to the very first centuries of Christianity, when the early Christians could not gather in churches because churches did not yet exist, or because persecution had shut them down. They gathered in homes. And in those homes, there was always a specific place, A corner set apart, a table, a wall, a small but deliberately chosen space where the community placed the signs of their faith, an image of Christ, a lamp burning, the Eucharistic bread when it was possible to keep it. That space was not decoration. It was the visible declaration that something more than a human family lived in that house. It was the sign that Christ was the Lord of that home. Teresa knew that tradition. She had lived it from childhood in her father's house in Avila, where faith was not a private matter, but the visible axis around which everyone's life turned. And when she began her Carmelite reform and founded her first convents, she carried that understanding into every community she established. The oratory was not just another room. It was the center from which everything else radiated. The prayer that was born there did not stay there. It moved through the walls, traveled down the corridors, touched every cell, every kitchen, every moment of the day for those who lived in that space. The same is true of your home altar. When it is truly sanctified, when it has been prepared with intention and with the order Teresa knew, it is not merely a corner of your living room or bedroom. It is the center from which grace radiates outward into every room, toward every person living under that roof, toward every burden that family is carrying in silence. But when the altar is not sanctified, when it is there out of habit or inheritance, without anyone ever having truly understood what it means, something doesn't work. Prayers are said, but don't take flight. Candles are lit, but don't illuminate what needs illuminating. And the family feels, without being able to explain it, that something is missing, that there is a distance, that heaven is near, but the door won't quite open. Teresa has a name for that distance in her writings. She doesn't call it spiritual coldness or lack of vocation or lukewarm faith. She calls it a lack of recollection. And recollection for Teresa is not only an interior disposition of the soul, it is also an exterior disposition of the space where the soul prays. The two go together. There can be no true interior recollection in a space that has not been prepared to receive it. And there can be no truly sanctified altar if the soul that tends it has never understood what the altar is for. Holy Thursday is the night when this understanding takes on a different urgency. Because Holy Thursday is not just another day in the liturgical year. It is the night when Christ instituted the Eucharist, the night when the body and blood of Christ were made present for the first time in history under the forms of bread and wine, the night when the priesthood was born, the night when Christ washed the feet of his apostles and told them to do the same. It is the night most saturated with sacramental grace in the entire year. And that grace does not stay locked inside church walls. It seeks out homes. It seeks out altars. It seeks out hearts that have prepared a place to receive it. Teresa knew this, and what she did every Holy Thursday in her oratory was exactly that, prepare a place. But there is something in the way she prepared it, something in the order she followed and the intention she brought to each gesture that sets her apart from what most of us do when we put out fresh flowers or change a candle. There was something Teresa never left out, something she considered indispensable, and it has to do with a question we haven't yet answered. What is it that distinguishes an altar that prays on its own from one that stands mute even when it is filled with beautiful objects and burning candles? Holy Thursday begins liturgically in the afternoon with the Mass of the Lord's Supper. But Teresa of Jesus understood that preparation for that evening had to begin much earlier. Not on the morning of Holy Thursday, not the evening before. Teresa understood that Holy Thursday was the destination toward which all of Lent had been walking, and that arriving unprepared was like showing up to a wedding without having dressed for it. The grace of that night is not improvised, it is received, and receiving it requires having opened a door that many homes keep closed without even realizing it. In The Way of Perfection, Teresa writes with a clarity that can be unsettling. because it demands too much of us. That true prayer is not what happens when we kneel down, but what has been happening in everything we did before we knelt. The soul that prays in earnest does not flip a switch when it approaches the altar. It arrives at the altar carrying everything it has lived that day, that week, that liturgical season. It arrives laden with what it has seen, what it has thought, how it has treated the people it lives with, and the altar receives all of that. It doesn't filter, it doesn't sort, it receives whatever the soul brings. That is why Holy Thursday carries a different weight than any other day of the year, because it is the day when the whole church pauses to contemplate the precise moment when Christ decided to stay. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, really. Christ instituted the Eucharist that night because he wanted to remain, because he knew his disciples would need more than a memory. They would need a presence, and that presence, which the church guards in every tabernacle in the world, has a direct relationship with the altar in your home that very few people have ever fully grasped. The domestic altar is not a replica of the altar in church. It doesn't pretend to be, but it is its echo. It is the place where the family carries home something of what it receives at Mass, something of what the church offers, something that cannot remain enclosed within those walls, but must radiate outward into homes, so that faith is not just an hour on Sunday, but the fabric of every single day. Teresa understood this with a precision that astonished those around her. For her, the life of the convent and the life of the oratory were one and the same thing. What happened in the chapel during the divine office continued in the cell during personal prayer. And what happened in the cell during personal prayer prepared the soul for what it was about to receive in the chapel. It was a continuous circle, an unbroken conversation between the soul and God, one that the physical space either sustained or interrupted, depending on how it had been prepared. This is exactly what Teresa did differently on the eve of Holy Thursday. She did not wait until the night arrived to prepare her oratory. She began before, and the preparation was not merely material, not just cleaning and tidying and arranging fresh flowers. It was a preparation that began within and expressed itself outward, like water overflowing a full vessel. Teresa disposed herself interiorly to receive the grace of that evening, and that interior disposition took visible form in the way she transformed her oratory. There was one particular night which Teresa recounts in the book of her life, with a simplicity that sometimes conceals the enormity of what she is describing, when she found herself before her oratory and sensed that something was not right. Nothing was visibly wrong. The images were in place, the lamp was burning, the space was clean. But Teresa felt with that spiritual sensitivity she herself describes as a gift she did not choose, but simply received, that the oratory was not ready to receive what that night was bringing. And she stayed there, on her knees, until she understood what was missing. What she found that night was not an object. It was not a new image, or a flower, or a different candle. It was an understanding, a way of grasping what that space is for, and what must happen in the soul of the one who tends it before it can ever be truly ready. That understanding is what most homes have never had, and it is the reason why so many domestic altars are filled with beautiful objects, genuine goodwill, and sincere love. And yet something still won't quite light up. Something won't quite catch. The prayer is said, but doesn't soar. The candle lights the space, but doesn't light the soul. And the family continues to carry in silence things that the altar, if it were truly sanctified, could help them set down. What Teresa found that night, what she understood kneeling in her oratory on the eve of a celebration she lived with an intensity that few people in history have matched, has to do with something she herself describes in her writings as the indispensable condition of all true prayer. It is not a technique. It is not a method. It is something far simpler and far more demanding at the same time. And it has everything to do with what you are about to hear. Because what Teresa did in her oratory that night did not begin with her hands. It began with something she had come to understand about the nature of Holy Thursday that very few of her contemporaries had grasped, and that remains to this day one of the best-kept secrets of her spirituality. What Teresa found that night in her oratory did not come all at once. It was not a sudden illumination that fell on her like lightning while she prayed. It was something that arrived slowly, with the unhurried pace of things that last, the kind of understanding you do not forget because it cost you time and silence and the willingness to remain still before something not yet fully understood. Teresa was like that. She describes it herself in the book of her life when she speaks of her way of praying in the years when she was still learning to listen. She did not flee from silence, even when silence was costly. She stayed in it even when it seemed empty, because she had learned over time and through grace that silence which appears empty is often the silence that is about to be filled with something no word could have brought. That night, kneeling before her oratory, Teresa understood something about the altar that no one had explained to her in quite those words, but which she had been living without knowing how to name it for years. She understood that the altar is not an object. It is not a table with images on top. It is not a corner decorated with devotion and love, though devotion and love are necessary. The altar is a relationship. It is the visible sign of a relationship between the soul that lives in that home and the God that altar names. And like every relationship, it needs to be tended. It needs attention. It needs someone to ask from time to time whether the relationship is still alive or whether it has become routine. Routine is the great danger that Teresa points to in her writings with an insistence that can feel, at times, almost stern. Not wickedness, not lukewarmness understood as lack of desire. Routine. Doing things because they have always been done that way. Because grandmother did it that way. Because there has always been an altar in that corner, and it has always had that image and that candle and those flowers, without anyone ever pausing to ask whether what is there is still alive or whether it has become one more piece of furniture, familiar and present and invisible all at once. Teresa had seen this in her own convents. She had seen sisters who recited the divine office with perfect punctuality and admirable faithfulness, and yet prayed as though they were fulfilling an obligation rather than meeting a person. They said the right words at the right time in the right posture. And yet something was not lit. Something at the heart of that prayer had gone dark, even though everything on the outside was working with great precision. And Teresa, who had an extraordinary capacity for seeing what others could not, knew exactly what was missing. What was missing was the awareness of who was being spoken to. What was missing was the real presence of Christ at the center of that moment of prayer. That is what Holy Thursday makes possible in a way that no other day of the year repeats. Holy Thursday is the night when the Church celebrates the birth of the Eucharist, and the Eucharist is, for Teresa, the center of everything. Not one of the centers, the center. In the book of her life, Teresa writes about a Eucharistic devotion with an intensity that is sometimes difficult to read without feeling that she is describing something we barely graze with our fingertips. For her, Christ in the Eucharist was not a doctrine to be believed. It was a presence to be encountered, a person to be looked at, spoken with, listened to, loved, with the same concreteness with which you love someone sitting right across from you. And if Christ in the Eucharist is a real presence, then the home altar, which is the domestic echo of that presence, cannot be furniture. It cannot be routine. It cannot be something that is there because it has always been there. It must be the place where that presence is honored in an active, conscious, deliberate way. The place where the family says, through concrete gestures and not just words, that it knows who lives in that tabernacle, and that it wants to carry something of that presence into the walls of its own home. What Teresa did in her oratory every Holy Thursday was exactly that. Not a decorative gesture, not an inherited tradition. It was an act of love directed toward a specific person, with full awareness of what that night meant and of what that oratory could receive if it was prepared to receive it. And the preparation began with something Teresa considered indispensable, something she never left out, something that appears in her writings in a way you have to know how to read in order to find, because it is not in the headings or the most quoted chapters, but in the small moments, in the details that reveal how she actually lived her faith, not just how she thought about it. That something has to do with order. Not exterior order, not cleanliness and the arrangement of objects, though that also mattered to Teresa. Interior order. The way the soul positions itself before the altar before touching anything, before lighting a single candle, before placing a single flower. Because Teresa understood that the hands that sanctify an altar carry with them everything the soul holds in that moment. And if the soul arrives at the altar laden with hurry, with distraction, with unresolved anxieties, with grudges not yet released, those hands cannot sanctify anything. They can decorate, they can tidy, they can make the space look beautiful to the eye, but they cannot sanctify. Sanctification for Teresa was always a movement that began within and expressed itself outward, never the reverse. And this is what most homes do not know, and it is what leaves so many altars filled with the right objects, arranged in the right way, and yet remaining mute, remaining beautiful but empty, like a letter written in perfect penmanship with nothing to say. The full account of what Teresa specifically did, step by step, gesture by gesture, in that preparation that began from within, is still coming. And what follows next is exactly that. Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote something in the book of her life that her editors for centuries placed among the passages of lesser importance, because it seemed too domestic, too concrete, too theologically modest to deserve attention alongside her great visions and her descriptions of the soul's dwelling places. But those who have read Teresa with the patience she herself asked of her readers know that her most revealing moments are found not on the peaks, but in the valleys. Not in the descriptions of her highest experiences, but in the small details of how she lived her faith day to day. And among those small details, there is one that has a direct bearing on the home altar and on Holy Thursday, one that no one has explained clearly because no one has stayed with it long enough to truly understand it. Teresa writes, in that plain way of hers that seems simple but has layers, that the very first thing she did before preparing her oratory for any major celebration was not to touch anything. It was to stop, to stand quietly before the space she was about to prepare and look at it as though she was seeing it for the very first time. Not to critique it, not to evaluate it, to see it. To ask herself in silence what was in that space that truly belonged to God, and what was only hers, placed there out of habit or affection or the desire to have something beautiful fill that corner. This distinction, which seems subtle, was for Teresa the most important of all. Because in her own words, Saint Teresa wrote that not everything that adorns an oratory sanctifies it, and not everything that sanctifies it is visible to the eye. This is the key the central thread has been waiting for. Not everything that adorns sanctifies. Not everything that beautifies the altar makes it a place where grace can enter and remain. There may be objects on your altar that are there out of genuine love, but which, without your knowing it, are speaking the wrong language. Objects that were born of fear rather than faith. Objects that represent a negotiation with God rather than an offering. Objects that belong to a grief not yet released, or to a promise made in a moment of desperation that has sat there for years like an unpaid debt rather than a free act of love. Teresa recognized them, and when she did, she removed them, not harshly, with tenderness, with the tenderness of someone who understands that behind every misplaced object is a heart that did the best it could with what it knew. What Teresa placed in her oratory for Holy Thursday had three characteristics she considered indispensable, characteristics that appear scattered but consistent throughout her writings. The first was simplicity. Teresa had a complicated relationship with decorative beauty. She did not reject it. She understood that beauty can be a form of love, but she distrusted the beauty that seeks to impress, that wants the altar to appear grand or rich or important. For her, the Holy Thursday altar should be simple, with the simplicity of the upper room, a clean space, an uncluttered space, a space that said, without words, that what matters is not what is on it, but to whom it is directed. The second characteristic was light, not just any light. Teresa was very specific about the light in the oratory, and what she wrote about a candle burning before an image of Christ has nothing to do with decoration. The candle, for Teresa, was a declaration. It was the soul saying in visible terms, I am here, I am awake. I have chosen to burn rather than stay cold. The candle was not lit to illuminate the space. It was lit to tell Christ that in this home there was someone who had understood what Holy Thursday meant, that there was someone awake while the world slept, like the wise virgins in the parable that Teresa loved and quoted often in her writings. The third characteristic was the one she found hardest to explain to her sisters, and the one that mattered most to her. She called it naked intention, placing each object on the altar without asking anything in return, without bargaining, without saying, even in silence, I am putting this here so that God will help me with that. Naked intention was the unconditional offering, the gesture that says simply, this is yours, not because I need something, not because I am afraid of what might happen if I don't, but because I love you, and because this space is yours, and because I want what is in it to say that clearly. When these three characteristics are present, simplicity, light, and naked intention, the altar ceases to be furniture and becomes what it was always meant to be. It becomes a dwelling place. In the most Teresan sense of that word, a place where someone truly lives. And if Christ truly lives in that altar, something happens in the home that surrounds it, something without a precise name in ordinary language, but which everyone who has experienced it recognizes instantly because it is unmistakable. Something settles, something calms, something that was inexplicably tense begins to ease, and the family, without anyone having said a word, begins to move differently around that corner of the room, as if they somehow know, without words, that someone is there. There is a mistake that Teresa of Jesus describes in the way of perfection, with a patience that could only come from someone who has made that same mistake many times before understanding it. She doesn't call it a mistake by that name. Teresa was never unnecessarily harsh with herself or with those who read her, but what she describes has all the hallmarks of a mistake. It is done with good intentions, it produces unexpected results, and it can be corrected once you understand what is actually happening. The mistake is this: placing on the altar objects that speak more of what the soul needs than of what the soul offers. It seems like a small distinction. It changes everything, because there are two ways of approaching the home altar, and only one of them sanctifies. The first way is that of the soul that comes to the altar with needs in its hands, with fears, with requests, with unpaid debts to God, with everything it needs to have changed in its life, and that it hopes the altar will somehow help to change. This soul puts on the altar what it needs, an image of a favorite saint because that saint helped once and might help again. A candle in a specific color because someone said that color draws this or repels that. A prayer card from a novena started but never finished. A promise made in a moment of anguish still waiting to be fulfilled. All of it accumulates on the altar over time, and the altar gradually fills with needs, without anyone noticing that it has stopped being a place of encounter with God and become instead a list of requests. Teresa recognized this altar. She had seen it in many homes during her years of foundations, and what she said about it was not a judgment on the faith of the person who had built it that way. It was an observation about what that altar could and could not do. An altar full of needs can be the place where a desperate soul kneels and weeps and finds comfort. That is real. That is valid. God hears from that altar just as from any other. But it is not a sanctified altar in the Teresan sense. It is not an altar that radiates grace into the home. It is an altar that absorbs, that accumulates, that holds the weight of everything the family has needed and not received, or received and not given thanks for. And that weight, over time, is felt. It's in the air of the room. It shows in the way prayer won't quite rise. The second way of approaching the altar is the one Teresa practiced. It is the way of the soul that arrives with empty hands. Not because it has no needs. Teresa had them, many, and some of them appear in her letters with a frankness that can be startling. She was constantly in need of concrete things: money for her foundations, health to keep working, understanding from those who misread her, protection for her sisters in distant convents. She had real needs, and she brought them to God without pretense. But when she approached her oratory to prepare it, she left the needs outside. She set them down at the door. And she entered with empty hands so that she could offer something rather than ask for something. This distinction between asking and offering is the heart of what Teresa understood by the sanctification of the altar. To sanctify is not to ask with greater intensity. It is not to place more objects or better objects or more theologically correct objects so that God responds more quickly to what we need. To sanctify is to prepare the space so that God can enter. And God, in Teresa's understanding, does not enter where a list is waiting. God enters where a heart is waiting, a heart that has emptied its hands in order to receive what God wishes to give, which does not always match what the heart had asked for, but is always more than the heart had imagined. The signs that a home altar is functioning as a list of requests rather than a place of encounter are concrete and recognizable. The first is accumulation. When the altar keeps growing without order, when every few months something new arrives that no one quite remembers placing there, when there are more objects than empty space, that is a sign, not of bad faith, of confusion between asking and offering. The second sign is conditionality. When something on the altar is there with an implicit condition, this stays until such and such happens, or this was put here when I asked for something and I haven't removed it because it still hasn't come. That object is not offering. It is negotiating, and negotiation does not sanctify. The third sign, the hardest to recognize because it is the most intimate, is the altar built from fear. Not from love, but from fear. Fear that if no candle is burning, something dark might enter. Fear that if a particular saint's image is not in a particular spot, the protection won't hold. Fear that if a certain object is removed, fortune will turn or health will fail. Teresa was very clear about this. Objects of devotion are not magic shields. They are signs of love. And when they stop being signs of love and become shields, they have lost what made them sacred. They have lost the relationship that animated them. And a sign without a relationship is just an object, perhaps beautiful, certainly familiar, but mute. Recognizing which of these signs is present in your home altar does not require theological training. It requires honesty. The same honesty Teresa asked of her sisters when she invited them to examine their prayer, not to judge it, but to know it, to understand where they were truly praying from love or from fear, from offering or from negotiation, from trust or from doubt dressed up as devotion. That honesty is the first step toward a truly sanctified altar. And Holy Thursday is the exact moment when that honesty can become action. Sanctifying the home altar. This Holy Thursday begins, as everything truly Teresan does, not with the hands, but with the soul. Teresa of Jesus never separated the exterior gesture from the interior movement that gave it life. For her, a gesture without interiority was an empty gesture, regardless of how correct it was in form or how beautiful it appeared to the eye. And an interior movement without outward expression was incomplete, because the human soul is not pure spirit, but spirit enfleshed, and what happens within must take visible form without in order to be real in a way the body and concrete life can sustain. That is why the first step Teresa practiced before touching her oratory was the one she herself describes as the threshold step. Not the physical threshold of the oratory door, though that mattered too. The interior threshold, the moment when the soul consciously steps out of the logic of the world and into the logic of God. In the world's logic, time is scarce, and what matters most is what is most urgent. In God's logic, the most valuable time is the time given freely and without hurry, and what matters most is what is eternal. Crossing that threshold is not automatic. It does not happen simply because you kneel or because you approach the altar with good intentions. It requires a deliberate act, a moment of stillness, a breath that says, "What came before this moment, I leave there. What begins now is different." Teresa recommended and practiced herself, beginning the preparation of the altar with a brief but fully present prayer, not a long or elaborate one. Just a few words directed to Christ with complete awareness of who was being addressed. Words that said, in essence, "What I'm about to do is for you, not for me. Not so the house looks good, or so that those who walk in will see how devout I am. For you." This intention, spoken quietly aloud or only in the heart, was for Teresa the difference between beginning to sanctify and beginning to decorate. The second step was cleaning, and here Teresa was specific in a way her sisters sometimes found excessive. Cleaning the altar was not a household chore, it was an act of humility. It was the soul saying with its hands that this space deserves care, that nothing neglected or dusty or carelessly piled up can be a worthy place for the presence it seeks to honor. Cleaning the Holy Thursday altar, wiping the dust from the images, changing the water in the flowers, removing what was no longer living, reorganizing what had accumulated without intention, was for Teresa an act of reverence. It was the preparation of the space, just as the disciples prepared the upper room, with attentiveness, with care, with awareness of who they were preparing it for. The third step was selection, and this is where Teresa's teaching becomes most demanding, because to select is also to remove. It means looking at each object on the altar and asking, honestly and without attachment, whether it is there because it speaks of love or because it speaks of something else. Whether it is there because it is a sign of faith or because it is a habit no one has revisited in years. Whether it is there because it offers or because it asks. And whatever fails that question, remove it. Not throw it away, not destroy it. Simply take it off the altar and let the space breathe. A Holy Thursday altar sanctified in the Teresan manner has few elements, but each one has been chosen consciously. An image of Christ, preferably related to the Passion or the Eucharist, because Holy Thursday is the night of both. A white candle, because white is the color of truth and of the Easter that is drawing near. Simple flowers, if you have them, not to beautify, but to offer something living, something that costs a little, something that will not last, which is precisely why it says that what is offered is real and not permanent, like every true offering. And an empty space. A space deliberately left clear, with no object, no image, nothing filling it. That empty space was, for Teresa, the most important of all. It was the place where God could put whatever God wished to put. It was the visible sign that the soul hadn't filled everything with its own ideas, but had left room for what it could not yet imagine. The fourth step was the prayer of surrender. Not the prayer of petition, the prayer of surrender. To kneel before the prepared altar and remain there in silence for a time, measured not in minutes but in presence, not asking for anything, not planning anything. Simply being there, with the altar before you and Holy Thursday all around, with the awareness that on this night the entire church is doing the same thing in every church in the world, and that this domestic altar is the echo of all those altars, the extension of the Last Supper into the small and sacred space of a home that has decided that Christ is its center. When all four steps are complete, when the soul has crossed the interior threshold, cleaned with humility, selected with honesty, and surrendered in silence, the altar is sanctified, not because the gestures carry some kind of magical power, but because the gestures have been the language through which a heart has told God something that words alone cannot fully say. And God, who reads hearts more than words, answers in that language in a way that the entire home begins to feel. There is something that happens in a home when the altar has been sanctified in the way Teresa understood. Something without a precise name in ordinary language, but which everyone who has experienced it recognizes at once, because it is unmistakable. It is not an extraordinary phenomenon. It is not a vision or a mystical experience reserved for the most advanced souls. It is something far simpler and, at the same time, far deeper. It is a change in the temperature of the home. Not the physical temperature, though sometimes that too is noticeable. The spiritual temperature. The invisible climate that makes a house either a place where the soul rests or a place where the soul tenses up for no reason it can name. Teresa describes this in the Interior Castle when she speaks of how the soul that has reached a certain degree of recollection transforms involuntarily the space it inhabits. It does not do this intentionally. It does not do it through effort. It does it because a soul in recollection radiates something the environment receives. Teresa uses the image of fire. Fire does not decide to warm what is near it. It warms because that is its nature, and the soul that burns in the love of God, the soul that has learned to pray with real presence and not merely correct words, transforms its surroundings in the same way that fire transforms the air around it, without effort, without explicit intention, by nature. The same is true of the sanctified altar. An altar prepared with the 4 steps Teresa practiced, the interior threshold, the humble cleaning, the honest selection, the silent surrender, is not a static object. It is a point of radiance, a place from which something moves outward into the rest of the home in a way that cannot be explained by physics, but can be experienced in life. The people who live in that home begin to notice, without anyone telling them anything, that something has shifted, that there is a calm that wasn't there before, that conflicts which used to escalate quickly now stop before they reach the breaking point, that the children sleep differently, that conversations have a different quality, that there is something in the air of that house that makes walking into it feel different from walking out. This is not magic. Teresa was the first to reject any magical interpretation of the spiritual life. This is the natural consequence of a home having been consciously oriented toward God. When the center of a home is occupied by something true, by a real presence honored through real gestures, everything else organizes itself around that center differently, like planets around the sun, not because the sun pushes them by force, but because the sun's gravity gives them the order they would otherwise lack. The family that has a truly sanctified altar in its home does not need anyone to explain what is happening. It feels it. It lives it. It notices it in the way that problems are still problems, but no longer carry the same crushing weight. In the way that prayer said before, that altar has a different quality than prayer said anywhere else. In the way that corner of the home becomes, over time, the place family members go when they need to think, when they are grieving, when they are grateful, when they don't quite know what they need, but they know that there, in that place, they will find something they cannot find anywhere else. Teresa speaks of this when she describes the oratory of her convents as the heart of the community. Not the refectory where they ate together, not the cloister where they walked together. The oratory, the place where each sister entered alone and left changed. The place where the community was not physically present, but was present in the spirit of each one who prayed there. Because all had prayed in that same space, and all had left something of themselves in it, and what each one left behind remained in some way that Teresa did not try to explain rationally, but only to confirm through experience. The home with a sanctified altar works the same way. It is the smallest community and the most important of all, and it has a heart, and that heart beats differently when it has been prepared with the right intention on the right night. Holy Thursday is that night, not because other nights don't matter, because Holy Thursday carries a specific grace, a liturgical opening that the Church celebrates and that heaven responds to, which makes the preparation of the home altar something qualitatively different from what it would be on any other day of the year. It is like planting a seed in the earth at exactly the moment the earth is ready to receive it. The seed is the same, the earth is the same, but the timing means that what might have taken years to grow can begin to sprout in days. There is something more that Teresa noted about homes with sanctified altars, something she observed during her years of foundations when she visited the homes of the families who welcomed her and supported her work. She could tell, with a certainty she attributed to grace and not to any power of her own, whether a home had a living altar or a mute one. She didn't need to see it. She felt it upon entering. There were homes that received her with a peace she recognized at once, because it was the same peace she sought in her own oratory. And there were homes that, regardless of how clean and orderly they were, how filled with religious images, received her with a heaviness she felt in her chest from the very first step inside. The difference was always the altar, not its appearance, its interior life, what the soul who tended it had placed within it and how. Tonight, when everything that came before has settled, when the words have found their place and the silence returns to being the silence of your home, there will be a moment when you stand up and look at your altar. You will look at it differently, not with the eyes that have seen it every morning of these years, with the eyes of someone who has just understood something they did not know before, and who now sees that familiar corner as if for the very first time. That moment, that instant when the altar that has always been there suddenly strikes you differently, is the moment Teresa has been waiting for you. It is the moment for which everything before was preparation. Sanctifying the altar tonight is not a project for tomorrow. It does not require special materials or knowledge you don't yet have. It requires what Teresa always asked for, and what is always the hardest thing to give: real presence. The presence of someone who approaches that corner with awareness of what they are doing and for whom they are doing it. Holy Thursday does not wait until you feel perfectly ready. Holy Thursday is already here, and the grace of this night is not stored away for next year. It is here now, real, available, waiting for a home that has prepared a place to receive it. Teresa of Jesus founded 17 convents in her lifetime. Each one began with an oratory. Each oratory began with an altar. And each altar began with a soul that understood that what it was doing was not building a space, but opening a door through which Christ could enter and stay, a door that once opened with the right intention, remains open in a way that time does not shut and forgetfulness does not cancel. Because what is offered to God with true love does not disappear. It is transformed. It becomes part of the invisible fabric of that home, something that the generations who come after will breathe in without knowing exactly where that peace comes from. That quiet, that sense of something more than walls and furniture and people sharing a roof. The altar you sanctify tonight can be the beginning of something that outlasts your own life. Teresa understood it that way. She did not found convents for her own generation alone, but for all the generations that would follow. Every stone she placed, every oratory she prepared, every altar she arranged with her own hands was a legacy she knew would outlive her. And the altar in your home can be the same. It does not need to be grand. It does not need to be rich. It needs to be true. It needs to have been prepared by hands that understood what they were doing, and that did it with love and with the naked intention Teresa taught. This is yours, Lord, without conditions, without bargaining, without a list. Simply this, which is all I have, offered with everything I am. There is something Teresa wrote near the end of her life, when she had founded most of her convents and her body was exhausted but her soul was more ablaze than ever, that sums up everything this Holy Thursday can be for your home. In her own words, Saint Teresa wrote that the soul that has learned to offer without asking has found the secret of prayer, because it has discovered that God does not need to be convinced, only welcomed. This sentence, which seems straightforward, contains an entire theology. God does not need to be convinced. He does not need the right candle or the right image or flowers of the right color. He needs to be welcomed. He needs the soul kneeling before that altar to have prepared a real space, a space emptied of itself, where he can enter and find that there is room for him. That is what the sanctified altar does. That is what Holy Thursday permits, with a grace that no other day of the year offers in quite the same way. And that is what Teresa of Jesus wanted you to know tonight, not as information, but as an invitation. An invitation to rise when this ends, to walk toward that corner of your home and to do what she did. Cross the interior threshold, clean with humility, choose with honesty, surrender in silence, and stay there as long as you need to, without hurry, without a list. Just you, your altar, and a Holy Thursday that tonight is not a memory but a presence, waiting for you to open the door. What begins in your home tonight does not end tonight. It is the start of a new way of living with that corner, of caring for it, of understanding what it means and what it can do for your family. Teresa lived it until the very last day of her life, and the peace she radiated, that peace which those who knew her described as something you could physically feel in her presence, began in a small oratory before a simple altar on a night when she decided that that space was not going to be one more piece of furniture. You can make that same decision tonight, and everything else, as always in the spiritual life, will follow. You stayed, and that tells me everything I need to know about you. Not everyone stays. Not everyone has the patience to hear everything that came before, to let the words settle slowly, to allow something that seemed as simple as a home altar to become all of a sudden this important. But you stayed, and that means something Teresa taught reached you in a place you recognized, not because it was new to you, because it was true. And truth, when it finally arrives in the right words, doesn't feel like information. It feels like coming home. Tonight, you know something that this morning you didn't know with this clarity. You know that the altar in your home is not decoration. You know that Holy Thursday is not a date on the calendar but a door of grace that heaven opens once a year with a generosity that has no equal. You know that sanctifying that space requires no wealth, no special training, no materials you don't already have. It requires what Teresa always asked for, and what you already possess. A heart willing to offer rather than only to ask. A heart that has learned tonight the difference between an altar that decorates and an altar that prays. Between a space filled with objects and a space filled with presence. Between a habit and a living relationship with Christ. One that begins in that corner of your home and transforms everything outward from there. You carried a name with you to this place. You wrote it in the comments, or you held it quietly in your heart. That name has a place tonight in the altar you are about to sanctify. And that, even if you don't feel it, yet the way Teresa described it, is already prayer, already love, already the beginning of something that will not end tonight. There is something I want to ask of you before you go. And it has nothing to do with this Holy Thursday, but with everything that comes after. Because Holy Week does not end on Holy Thursday, it ends at Easter. And Easter does not end on Resurrection Sunday. Easter, in the soul that has learned to receive it, lasts forever. Every mystery you have contemplated in these days, every teaching of Teresa that has reached you, every moment when you felt something stir within you while you listened, each one is a seed, and seeds need to keep growing. There is something Teresa of Jesus taught about what happens after an experience of grace that very few people know. She lived it many times. The soul receives something luminous, something that moves it deeply, something that transforms it in a way it cannot entirely explain. And then comes the temptation to let that moment remain only that, a moment, to return to routine, to keep it as a beautiful memory rather than letting it continue to work. Teresa struggled against that temptation her whole life, and what helped her overcome it was not discipline or willpower. It was continuing to feed what had begun, continuing to seek, continuing to listen, continuing to return to the oratory even when the soul felt nothing, even when prayer seemed dry, even when the silence did not break the way she hoped. That is what I am asking of you tonight. Don't let what you received here remain only in this moment. When YouTube shows you what comes next, watch it. Let what Teresa still has to teach you continue to arrive. Because there are things she wrote about the soul, about prayer, about home, about those we have loved and lost, about what awaits us on the other side of this life, that have not yet reached you, and they are waiting. With the same patience with which Teresa waited for her sisters in the oratory, without impatience, without reproach, with the quiet certainty that whoever has truly begun to seek cannot stop, because the search itself is already the encounter. What comes after this video was prepared with the same care with which you are going to prepare your altar tonight, with intention, with love, with the hope that it reaches the exact souls who need it. Souls like yours. Don't let it pass you by. Thank you for being here, for carrying that name you hold in your heart, for staying until the end when it would have been so much easier to turn this off and get on with the day. Teresa of Jesus had a way of saying goodbye to her sisters that never quite sounded like a goodbye. It always sounded like a promise, as if every farewell were really the threshold of something that had not yet begun. I want to say goodbye to you tonight in the same spirit. May the Lord of this Holy Thursday dwell in your altar, in your home, and in every person who lives under that roof. May the grace of this night not go out when the candle goes out. May it remain lit in that corner of your home, invisible but real, as the presence of Christ remains burning in every tabernacle in the world, waiting for someone to draw near, to kneel, to say with their presence what Teresa said with hers. Here I am, Lord. This space is yours. This home is yours. I am yours. Until next time.